The land. The ancient Egyptians viewed their country as a flat strip of agricultural land at the center of a dish-shaped world. The black, fertile soil of this terrain gave the country its most common name, Ketmet, the black land. The hieroglyphic for the land reflects is showing a flat strip of land, often with three circles below it, illustrating clumps of earth. Egypt's agricultural wealth led Osiris to play a major mythological role in the daily lives of its people as a god who embodied the principle of regeneration. He was responsible for the growth of the crops each year. The land as a whole, however, was a manifestation of Geb, while the Memphite god Teten, who primarily symbolized the first mount of creation, could sometimes, by extension, represents all the fertile land emerging from the residing inundation and even Egypt itself. The Egyptians divided their country into Delta and Nile Valley, Lower and Upper Egypt, respectively. The Egyptians divided their country into Delta and Nile Valley, Lower and Upper Egypt, respectively, which were themselves subdivided into a series of administrative septwat, district or province, better known today by their Greek name, nomes. Their number varied from time by the later phases of Egyptian history. There were 42 nomes, 20 in Lower Egypt and 22 in Upper Egypt. Each nome was identified by its own emblem and personified by its own goddess, shown with the nome embelled upon her head. The deities within the major temples of each nome could either be unique or local forms of major state gods, such as Horus. So, for example, in Upper Egypt, Thoth was the major god of the 15 nome, with his center of Hermopolis, Anubis of the 17 nome, and Nepti of the 18 nome. Over time, mythologies developed around these deities, their nomes and temples. Papyrus Jummalhat records myths special to the 17th and 18th Upper Egypt nomes. Noah's from El Arish details myth of the 20th nome of Lower Egypt, while Papyrus Brooklyn 47.218.84 collects together myths from a variety of Delta nomes, such of which are not known from any other source. Sometimes these myths were based on popular themes adapted from the local environment. Many temple sites, for example, claim to be the original spot of creation, the first land that rose from nome From this foundation, then they adopted the general Egyptian conception of creation around their own particular deities. Myth could also provide explanations for festivals, the local versions of the festival of consecrating the sticks held at Letopolis. Ooh, I'm hot. Oh man. In the Delta, commemorating a time when Horus and Seth, along with their followers, fought each other in the known, in the associated myth, while fighting their enemies, who have been taking forms of birds and capturing them in a net. Horus, for his followers, accidentally beat Osiris to death as he was trapped in the net with them. In the festival, the considered sticks were probably used to beat symbols of Horus' enemies, probably birds in nets. These myths and associations were not unchanging. For the example of the New Kingdom, the goddess Bat of the 17 Upper Egypt nome had been assimilated into the cult of Hathor from the 6th Upper Egyptian nome. Sometimes the tradition of local myth crossed known borders. The Osiris books, recording the rites performed during his festival at their dates, spread with their source in the 9th nome of the Upper Egypt to towns throughout the country. All the nomes had their own deities, and each temple developed its own mythology, normally based around certain core myths. Some locations were more mythologically charged than others. Gesti, probably the site of Khmer, near Esna in Upper Egypt, is where, according to the pyramid text, Seth murdered Osiris. It is also mentioned in Papyrus Mihak as the location where Isis defended the body of Osiris with Seth by manifesting herself into various forms, becoming the lion goddess Sekhmet, a dog, with a knife for a tail, and a serpent associated with Hathor. In this last form, we were informed that she went to a mountain in the north of the nome to watch the followers of Seth. When they descended the mountain, she attacked them, poisoning them with her venom. Their blood fell on the mountain and became juniper berries. Another version of events in the same papyrus speaks of Isis and Nephthys at their side, transforming into a uraeus and biting her enemies and throwing laces at them. Gesti is also where the gods are said to be buried. These include Shu, Osiris, Horus, and Hathor of Gesti. Though later in Egyptian history, many temples claim to be the site of the divine burials. The Nile, cutting through the eastern Sahara and following from south to the north where it joins the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile enabled life to flourish on its banks. For much of Egypt's length, the Nile is a single river, but at the point of modern Cairo and ancient Memphis, it breaks into many channels, forming the great marshlands of the delta. Today there are only two branches, but in ancient times there were five. These great divided between valley and delta, created by the Nile, fueled the Egyptians' obsessions with dualism. The country could be referred to as the two lands, each represented by its own crown. The red crown for Lower Egypt and the white crown for Upper Egypt. Furthermore, the goddess Nephknet and Waget came to represent Upper and Lower Egypt respectively. Sorry, it's not respectively. Nekhbet, meaning she of Nekheb, the site of modern El Kab, is normally depicted as a vulture and often wears the white crown, while Waget was depicted as a snake wearing the red crown. The most significant event of the year was the inundation of the Nile, a period of roughly 3 months, our July, August, and September, when the river burst into banks and spread rich aluminum onto the land, perfect for growing crops, once the waters had receded. This peculiar natural event was of consistent interest to the Egyptians and foreigners too, who sought to explain it. Over time, the annual occurrence became a symbol of cynical rebirth, shaping the natural psyche, fueling mythology, and reinforcing the Egyptians' belief that they were indeed blessed by the gods. One sign that the river was about to rise was the appearance of the star Sirius after an absence of about 70 days. Another was a noise emanating from a cavern beneath the shrine of the goddess Setet at Elephantine, the accepted source of the Nile at the country's traditional southern border. The gods propitiated noon in this cave, and even Re is said to have visited noon there. To the Egyptians, all waters entering the world came from Nun, and the Nile was no different. It was the high Nile coming forth as fresh Nun, the inert waters of Nun, inaccessible and infinite, completely surrounding the world, always threatened to break into and overwhelm creation. Indeed, any time a hole was dug and underground water was reached, there was none breaking in. Although the Nile itself was not personified as a god, the inundations was referred to as the arrival of the god Happy, and it was through his actions that the fertility was brought back to the land. When depicted, Happy typically has blue skin and swollen belly and a loin cloth. A clump of papyrus rests upon his head, above his long hair, and he has pendulous breasts, a sign of his fertility. He often carries a trail full of offering. Like Nun, Happy was thought to live in a cavern at Elephantine. However, no one knows the place he is in. His cavern was not found in books. Though Happy lacked cult temples, Egypt's population praised him with hymns and music. He was the one who floods the fields that Re has made to nourish all that thirst. When the flood earth rejoices, every belly jubilates, every jawbone takes on laughter, every tooth is bared. It was understood that all food existed because of Happy's work, and that the clothing and books could only be manufactured through his flood enabled flax and papyrus to grow. All herds were flattened because Happy allowed crops to grow. Indeed, the bounty that followed Happy's appearance was more precious than any treasure. No one beats his hand with gold. No man can get drunk on silver. One cannot eat lapizuli. On the other hand, if Happy made it only a decimal appearance, chaos descended. Everyone was poor. People died and fighting broke out. The Nile inundations was also regarded as the tears of Isis, and the flood that leaked from Osiris's corpse, spreading his regenerative force upon the lifeless oil, reviving and energizing it. With the waters receding, or whenever the Egyptians offered water to Osiris, it was regarded as entering Osiris's dead and dry corpse, bringing him back to life, just as the Ka spirit had to return to the body after death to rejuvenate the deceased. The river was as dangerous as it was living. The river was as dangerous as it was life-giving. Drowning was a frequent risk, while crocodiles and hippopotamus dwelt in its depth, always ready to snatch people in their jaws and drag them to their deaths. For this reason, myth developed around the dangerous creatures that lived in the banks and in the rivers, and they became worshipped as gods. For example, Sobek. Sobek, typically depicted as a crocodile-headed man, Sobek wore a horn, sun disk, and plums, and is described in the pyramid text as the son of the goddess Neith. Temples were built to him at particularly dangerous locations along the Nile, especially those where crocodiles might strike, such as at Camp Ombo in Upper Egypt, and in the Phylum. As a god, he was associated with the riverbanks and the marshland, and in some sources the Nile was said to be his sweat. He also fished out Horus' hands from the Nile after Isis severed them. Apparently, the hands kept slipping out of his fingers, so he became the first person to invent a net. Not content to dwell just in the river, Sabbat was also called the Lord of Baku, a mythological mountain on the horizon where he lived in a temple made of carnelians. Wow. That's him. Wow. Beyond the Nile Valley, the Egyptians regarded anything beyond the black, fertile soil of the Delta and Nile valleys as the desert, a place of disorder and danger, calling it this Heret, the Red Land, the abrupt separation between safe, life-giving greenery and savage, inhospitable danger was striking to the ancient Egyptians as it is to people today. To the west were the yellow domes and green oases to the western desert, while the east were the mountains and hills of the eastern desert. Each further beyond lay lands quite unlike Egypt, where strange people lived in a hilly terrain, contrasting with Egypt's level geography. Indeed, Egypt's natural borders enclosed as it is by the deserts to the east and west, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and the dangerous Nile contracts to the south, now lost in Lake Nazar, fostered an attitude of invisibility and separation from the rest of the world. A mindset of them and us was enhanced by any invaders or even peaceful traders emerging as they did, shimmering and unannounced from the hostile desert environments, products and personification of its inherent danger, like sandstorms, snakes, and scorpions, threatens Egypt's precious and pleasant cocoon. Consequently, images of the pharaohs smiting stereotyped foreigners became a symbol of royal, thus Egyptians' dominance, and of the world returning to its proper order state. It was in remote desert location at the Egyptian source many of their natural resources. Turquoise could be found in Sinai, and gold and semi-precious stones in eastern desert. Materials were often chosen because of the symbolic meaning of their colors. Green was associated with life, prosperity, and health. Black with duat, fertility, and rebirth. The veins of the serpentine appears snake-like, and so it was used to make amulets and statues to fight against snake bites and poisons. Red stones symbolize human flesh, while gold was the flesh of the gods and associated with the sun. Certain materials were provided with divine mythological origins. One myth records Horus cried and the water from his eyes fell on the ground. It ran out, and thus myrrh came into being. Geb did not feel well, and the blood from his nose fell on the ground. It ran out and became fir trees, and thus resins came into being from their sap. Shu and Tefnut were bitterly, and the water from their eyes fell onto the ground, ran out, and thus incense came into being. Papyrus salt 825. A red mineral found in the 18th nome of Upper Egypt was explained as bloodstained stone, left from a time when Anubis beheaded the followers of Seth on the mountains in the region. A myth from Budapest refers to the blood of the goddess Bastet falling and becoming turquoise. The desert lands were said to have been given to Seth, but other gods were also associated with the desert, often shown as a man or a hawk. Ash was a god of the western desert, with his responsibility including the various oases and Libya. Ash also calmed the angry deities that opposed the desert in the Duat. Another desert deity was Ha, identifiable by 3 hills he wears upon his head, the hieroglyphic symbol for foreign lands. He is depicted armed with either a knife or a bow and protected people from danger in western desert and at the oasis, especially from Nomads and Libyans. Since the sun sets in the west, the western desert was closely associated with death. Min and Hathor were thought to watch over desert routes, Min associated with the eastern desert, but his main divine responsibility was sexual procreativity. His fertility is emphasized by his black skin, like Egyptian fertile black soil, and his erect penis, and he normally rises one of his arms and threatening gesture showing Min's power to protect. He was also believed to send rain clouds out into the desert. Subdued as Lord of the East was similarly associated with Egypt's eastern frontier, protecting soldiers stationed at fortresses and mining outposts. When depicted as a man, he can be recognized by his long hair and pointed beard. The appearance of a in warrior. He is normally armed with a spear or axe and wore a crown of tall feathers. He is also shown as a crouching falcon with a veil over his shoulder. The goddess Paket, she who scratches, or the Tira, was an aggressive goddess with responsibility for the entrance of widest, dry riverbeds. Mines were connected with certain gods and goddesses too. At the turquoise mine, Aksabat El Kadim in the Sinai, members of mining expeditions prayed to Hathor, Lady of Turquoise. For protection, Hathor was known as the Lady of Malachite and further associated with gold and copper. dealing with the invisible in daily life. In addition to providing explanation for the physical features of the world around them, the mythological was imbued in every aspect of Egyptians' daily lives. Myth associated for failing ill, for good and bad days, and for dreaming. In this supernatural world, magic was powerful. Every tool employed to manipulate the environment and to ward off trouble, but its efficacies often relied on grounding in mythical precedent. The mythic, the supernatural, and the mundane were all intertwined in the Egyptians' daily lives. Mythology and temples. It is 20 BC, and you arrived at the great enclosure of all temple of Amun at Karnak. Its tall and gray rectangular shape, formed of its mud bricks laid in a wave pattern, looms above you, casting along shadows on the ground, shielding the temple complex. Within these walls mark a clear division between the hustle and bustle of the city, with its densely packed housing, squatting vendors, and refuse-strewn streets, and the pure sanctity of the God's house. You pass into grounds and see the sandstone walls of the temple of Amun beyond its entrance, a tall pylon gateway, flagpoles rising skyward. At its facade, images of the king in the company of the gods carved deep into the sandwood. The pylons, sheer-scaled, far taller than any building near your home, evokes a sense of awe, and you praise the gods for favoring Egypt. All around, pilgrims scratch at walls with their fingers, wanting to take home fragments of the temple divine power. Others rub statues of past nobles who squat or kneel before entrances like stone sentries, blankly gazing ahead as if petrified for eternity. Each of these wooden doorways temptingly leads into a sacred confines of Amun's house, but all are closed to you. Only on special occasions are they flung open, and the public temporarily allowed inside the temple's sacred interior, and even then, only as far as the outer courts. Their privileged pilgrims meet further statues of Egypt's past elite, men given royal permission to place their statues within the temple courtyards, and enabling them to take part eternally in the annual sacred festivals, to receive temple offerings, and to be close to the gods within. Today, however, it is not a special occasion. To enter the temple requires ritual purity, and not being a priest or a pharaoh, the highest priest in the land, you fail the test. An Egyptian temple was not a church or a mosque. It was not a place for the general population of a town or city to gather and pray on regular basis. It was a God's house, his earthly palace, an interface between sky and earth, a representation of the cosmos. It was also a mystically charged zone The enclosed wall serves as boundaries between order and disorder. Its wave-like mud bricks courses, perhaps imitating the waters of noon, lapping on the edge of creation. The pylon entrance represents the horizon, a place of transition between planes of existence. Its twin towers, the mountain peaks, and the flanks, the rising sun. The temple's straight axis mimic the course charted by the sun across the sky. The hypostyle hall represented marshlands and traditional place where the waters of noon gave way to the moan of creation. Its columns were the plants of this march, their capitals papyrus clusters or lotus flower. Simultaneously, the columns served as pillars of the sky, an image reinforced by star patterns painted on temple ceilings. The god sanctuary beyond, at the rear of the temple, was the first mound of creation, but also a representation of the sky, providing its divine occupant with familiar surrounding on earth. The different realms of creations were also built into the temple design. The ceiling and the upper parts of the wall reflected the sky realm. The lower walls and floor, the earth, and the crypts below the duat. Within his shrine, the god was manifest in his cult statue, formed of stone, gold, silver, or gilded wood, and adorned with precious stones. He was not always present, but he could inhabit it whenever he wished, merging with his physical form also that the high priest could interact with his previously invisible force. There in the sanctuary deep within the temple, priests performed rituals for the gods at sunrise, midday, and sunset, key moments in the daily life cycles of the sun, feeding him, clothing him, and anointing him with fragrance in hope that he might perform God's deed in return. They were exclusive rituals performed by a select few. Only a deity high priest and a king could set foot in the sanctuary. Those assisting in the rituals were regulated to the rooms and corridors outside. The average person then excluded from the gods in their temples, just as he was excluded from the king in his palace. The Egyptians required other means to build a relationship with the divine. So how might you contact a god? Wow.